By midnight, the snow was no longer falling from the sky. It was moving sideways across the wheat field. The wind carried it in long white sheets that erased the fence, the road, and most of the hill beyond the Brooks family's metal equipment shed. 14-year-old Ethan Brooks stood inside the open doorway beside his father, watching the beam of his flashlight disappear into the storm. Across the exposed ridge, a line of old wooden pallets trembled in the wind. Ethan had set them upright on steel posts, leaving narrow openings between the boards. They looked small against the open Kansas plain, but the storm struck them with enough force to make every section shake. One pallet remained straight. Another vibrated against its wire fasteners. At the far end of the line, a post had begun leaning toward the wheat. Behind the pallets, snow twisted through the gaps and settled in a long pale strip. On the neighboring section of field, the wind swept almost everything away, exposing dark soil and thin green leaves. Then the upper fastening on one pallet snapped loose. The wooden frame turned several inches and began striking the post. Ethan moved toward the doorway. His father, Marcus Brooks, raised one arm across his chest. "We are not going out in that," Marcus said. A loose pallet could become dangerous in the wind. A person could lose direction only a few yards from a shed. Whatever happened to the experiment, they would have to wait until visibility improved. Before we return to the beginning, subscribe if you enjoy stories about young people who notice small patterns before anyone else sees what they might mean. 7 weeks earlier, the Brooks farm near Tribune, Kansas, had held only a thin layer of early winter snow. The family grew winter wheat and sorghum on open ground where the horizon seemed to begin at the edge of every field. Wind was part of farming there. It dried soil, moved residue, and reshaped snow overnight. One raised section of the wheat field suffered more than the rest. After every storm, the snow disappeared from the ridge and collected in the roadside ditch. The young wheat remained exposed during the coldest nights. By spring, thin dry patches often appeared in the same place. Marcus considered it an unavoidable weakness in the field. Ethan began studying where the missing snow went. Behind an old slatted fence near the shed, he found a long shallow drift. The fence had not stopped the wind. It still passed through its openings. But the snow had stayed. Behind the storage building lay a pile of damaged pallets that could no longer support feed sacks safely. Ethan dragged one toward the ridge. His older sister watched him struggle with it. "You building a warehouse in the wheat?" she asked. Their neighbor Calvin stopped his pickup, laughed, and pointed at the wooden frame. Ethan did not answer. He was not trying to block the wind. He wanted to give the snow a reason to stop leaving. Ethan began comparing the snow behind different objects around the farm. A solid wall created a tall drift close to the building, followed by a nearly bare strip farther away. Wind struck the wall, rose sharply, and curled downward behind it. The old slatted fence produced a different shape. Because some air passed through, the snow settled in a longer, lower band instead of forming one steep pile. That was the effect Ethan wanted on the wheat ridge. A solid barrier could create powerful turbulence. It could pile snow too deeply in one place while scouring another section down to bare soil. The pallets were useful because their boards already contained openings. Marcus allowed Ethan to test a short line on one part of the ridge. A nearby section would remain open for comparison. They inspected every pallet before moving it into the field. Rotten frames were rejected. Protruding nails were removed or hammered flat. Cracked boards that could break loose were taken off. Together, Ethan and Marcus drove steel posts into the ground and attached the first pallets with heavy wire. But Ethan made 2 important mistakes. He placed the sections almost directly beside one another, creating a nearly continuous wooden wall. He also installed them too close to the first wheat rows. From the road, the line looked strange and unfinished. Calvin stopped again and laughed while pointing toward it. "The first real wind will spread those all the way to Colorado," he said. Ethan continued tightening the fasteners. He placed simple markers in the experimental and control areas so he could compare snow depth later. He also marked equal lengths of wheat row for spring observation. The first light storm arrived several days later. By morning, a tall narrow drift had formed directly beside the pallets. At first, Ethan felt encouraged. Then he walked farther into the field. Most of the raised wheat remained nearly as exposed as the untreated area. The barrier had trapped snow, but it had deposited almost all of it beside the wood. Some plants were buried beneath a deep compacted ridge while the rest received almost no protection. Ethan had changed the snow. He had not placed it where the field needed it. Marcus pushed a measuring rod into the drift beside the pallets. The snow was several times deeper there than across the center of the experimental area. If it settled, iced over, and melted slowly, the plants directly beneath it could remain cold and wet long after the surrounding wheat began growing. Too little snow left the crop exposed. Too much in one concentrated line could create another problem. The tight spacing between the pallets also reduced their porosity. Wind-driven snow began filling the narrow openings between boards, making the barrier more solid with every storm. Behind several sections, swirling air had cleared small patches completely. Then a strong nighttime gust damaged the line. One weak pallet tilted forward and pulled hard against its wire. The upper board cracked. If the fastening failed, the heavy frame could slide across the field or reach the nearby road. Marcus ended the first test immediately. "We either make it safe," he said, "or we take it all down." Ethan agreed. He and his father removed the damaged section and rebuilt the line farther upwind from the wheat. The additional distance would give snow room to settle gradually before reaching the crop. They left small gaps between the pallets instead of joining them into one solid wall. Each section received its own pair of posts and independent fasteners. One failure would not pull down the entire line. Ethan also extended the ends slightly beyond the marked test area. The original barrier had stopped too sharply, allowing wind to curl around its edge and carve a bare strip beside it. After the next small snowfall, the result looked different. A long, low tongue of snow formed behind the pallets. It reached part of the exposed wheat instead of remaining pressed against the wood. The distribution was still uneven. One end collected less snow. Near the missing pallet, the ground remained almost bare. Another section held more than Ethan wanted, but the snow now covered more of the ridge. It was a modest improvement, not proof that the system would survive a real storm. A few days later, the weather report warned of rapidly falling temperatures, strong wind, and blowing snow. Ethan checked every wire connection. Marcus checked them again. Then the sky over western Kansas turned gray. The temperature dropped before sunset. Dry wind passed over the wheat first, bending the young leaves close to the soil. Then snow began to fall. Within an hour, it moved almost parallel to the ground. Ethan and Marcus made one final inspection while visibility remained safe. They removed all tools, checked the posts, and returned to the equipment shed before the storm intensified. The redesigned pallet line received the full force of the wind. Air pushed through the openings between boards. Snow crossed the barrier, slowed, and settled farther downwind in pale streaks. Those streaks lengthened and began joining together over the wheat. On the untreated ridge, very little snow remained. The wind carried most of it toward the ditch, leaving green leaves visible between strips of dark ground. Behind Ethan's line, the field gradually turned white. But the method did not work evenly. Wind curled around one end and carved a curved bare patch beside the final pallet. Near the opposite end, a damaged opening allowed too much air through, leaving another thin area. The upper fastening on one section loosened. The pallet began vibrating against its post. For several hours, the snow continued building. The middle of the test area received the most even layer. Closer to the fence, a deeper drift formed. Near the edges, the cover remained weak. When the loose pallet twisted, Ethan could see it from a shed. He wanted to secure it. Marcus refused. The field was invisible beyond the nearest posts, and a swinging wooden frame could injure anyone who approached it. They waited until morning. After the wind weakened, Ethan and Marcus crossed the field carefully. One pallet hung at an angle and had to be removed. Several wire fasteners had stretched. A deep drift had formed near the first section. Yet most of the experimental ridge remained covered. The neighboring control area was nearly bare. The contrast was obvious, but Ethan knew the test was not finished. Snow protection was useful only if the wheat beneath it survived. They would not know that until spring. The Brooks family continued watching both sections throughout the winter. After later windy days, The remaining snow on the control ridge became thinner or disappeared completely. Behind the pallet line, a broader layer stayed in place. Ethan did not add more sections during frozen weather. He removed the damaged pallet during a calm period and checked the remaining fasteners only when conditions were safe. By early spring, the snow behind the pallets began melting. The moderate areas released moisture slowly into the soil. The ground remained damp longer than the exposed ridge. The deepest drift created a different result. There, the soil stayed cold and saturated. Several wheat plants emerged weak and yellow. A few did not recover. The system had not protected every plant equally. As the field greened, Ethan and Marcus compared equal lengths of row. On the untreated ridge, several thin patches appeared where plants had died or fallen behind. The surface dried quickly after warm wind returned. Across most of the experimental area, more plants remained alive, and the soil held moisture longer. The difference was useful but not dramatic. Near the ends of the pallet line, survival was little better than in the control area. Beneath the deepest drift, a small section performed worse and required reseeding. The pallets also required more work than Calvin had expected. Every section needed secure posts and separate fasteners. Damaged wood had to be discarded. The entire line had to be removed before field equipment entered the area. Such barriers could not be placed near roads, power lines, buildings, or livestock areas where a loose section might cause injury or damage. Their distance from the crop mattered. Their porosity mattered. Even the shape of the ends mattered. When Calvin visited in spring, he stood between the greener wheat and the thinner control rows. He no longer laughed. "Why did you move them so far from the crop?" he asked. "To give the snow room to settle," Ethan said, "and the spaces between them, so they would not become a solid wall." Marcus asked Ethan to keep the measurements and fastening plan from the corrected version. The following winter, the family did not surround the entire farm with pallets. They rebuilt only a short line beside the most exposed ridge and adjusted the end sections to reduce scouring. After a light snowfall, Ethan walked there alone. On the open side, wind had already uncovered strips of dark earth. Behind the wooden slats, a long quiet layer of snow rested over the wheat. Ethan checked one fastening and looked across the white ridge. He had not stopped the Kansas wind. He had only given the snow a place where it could stay.